Horror analysts study human war history for new fear concepts constantly. Part 1. Horror had been analyzing fear for 3,000 years, and she thought she had seen everything. In her office that existed between dimensions, she reviewed reports from 100 different worlds. Most species were predictable. They feared predators, disease, the dark, and death. The Dread Collective had been harvesting these terrors using them to sustain their realm and maintain their power across 17 dimensions. Today's assignment seemed routine. A new planet had been flagged by the scanning division. Earth, they called it, third planet from a yellow star, inhabited by bipedal mammals who called themselves humans. Initial scans suggested standard development. They had basic technology, nuclear capability, and a history of tribal conflicts. Nothing special. Hora opened the data file and began her review. She expected to spend maybe a week on this, catalog their fears of lions and tigers and bears, maybe note some interesting phobias about spiders or heights, then move on to the next assignment. The collective was always hungry for new material, but Earth looked disappointingly ordinary. She started with their evolutionary history. Humans had climbed down from trees, learned to walk upright, discovered fire. Standard progression. They formed tribes, developed language, created tools. All normal. She yawned, her form rippling with boredom across multiple dimensional planes. Then she opened the military history database. The first entry stopped her cold, the Battle of Thermopylae. She read it twice, thinking the translation software had malfunctioned. 300 soldiers had volunteered to hold a mountain pass against an army of hundreds of thousands. They knew they would die. They went anyway. They fought for 3 days, killing thousands of enemies before finally being overwhelmed. Hora sat back, her essence flickering with confusion. In her experience, species fled from certain death. They surrendered, they hid, they preserved themselves. These humans had walked straight into annihilation and smiled about it. The Persian king had been so disturbed by their defiance that he'd impaled their leader's head on a spear as a warning. She marked the file for deeper investigation and continued reading. The Mongol conquests, an empire that killed so many people that carbon dioxide levels dropped across the entire planet. Khan's armies were so efficient at massacre that forests regrew in abandoned farmlands, cooling the Earth's atmosphere. 40 million dead in a systematic campaign of terror that lasted generations. Hora felt something strange in her core. Was this unease? She had studied the feeding patterns of dimensional parasites, the extinction methods of cosmic predators, the torture techniques of the suffering realms. Nothing had ever made her feel uncomfortable before, but this was different. These humans had killed their own kind with industrial precision. She kept reading, she couldn't stop. The 30 Years' War. 8 million dead in conflicts over religious interpretation. Villages completely erased. Populations reduced by half. And then, impossibly, the survivors had sat down and created the Peace of Westphalia, inventing modern diplomacy while corpses still rotted in the fields. World War I. Trench warfare. Hora pulled up the visual records and watched in growing horror. Millions of men living in mud, surrounded by rats and disease, going over the top into machine gun fire on command. Poison gas. Artillery barrages that lasted for days. The Battle of the Somme killed 1 million soldiers for a few miles of destroyed Earth. She called her colleague Shrike into her office. He materialized beside her desk, his form curious and alert. "Look at this," she said, projecting the images into the space between them. They watched together as human soldiers charged across no man's land. The machine guns cut them down in waves. The survivors regrouped and charged again. And again. Officers blew whistles knowing they were sending men to certain death. The men went anyway. "Why?" Shrike whispered. "Why would they obey?" "I don't know," Hora admitted. "But look at what comes next." World War II. The Holocaust. 6 million Jews systematically murdered in camps designed specifically for industrial-scale killing, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoriums running day and night, children sorted from their parents on railway platforms, sent left or right, life or death decided in seconds. Shrike made a sound like tearing fabric. This is beyond predation. This is beyond survival. They're not eating these people. They're not even fighting them. They're just killing them because of what they believe or where they were born. Keep watching, Hora said quietly. The atomic bombs. Entire cities erased in seconds. Shadows of human beings burned into concrete. Survivors whose skin melted off their bodies. And the worst part, the part that made Hora feel something she'd never experienced before, was that the humans who dropped those bombs had agonized over the decision. They had debated it. They had understood exactly how terrible it was. And they had done it anyway. I need to call a meeting, Hora said. The senior staff needs to see this. An hour later, the entire analytical division had gathered in the conference chamber. 20 of the collective's best researchers materialized around the viewing sphere. Hora began the presentation. She showed them everything. The rape of the Cambodian genocide, the Rwandan massacres, the siege of Leningrad where people ate their own dead to survive, the firebombing of Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the gulags, the killing fields. By the end, several analysts had destabilized, their forms flickering and uncertain. One junior researcher had to be escorted out, overwhelmed by what humans called existential dread. The Dread Collective, beings who literally fed on fear, were experiencing terror for the first time in their existence. Ancient Whisper Al, the division head, sat silent for a long moment. Her form was still, but darkness pooled around her like ink in water. This changes everything, she finally said. We thought we understood fear. We thought we were masters of terror, but these humans, they don't just experience horror, they create it, they systematize it, they industrialize it, and worst of all, they do it to themselves. What do you mean? Asked one of the senior analysts. Look at the pattern, Al explained. In every case, humans are killing other humans. Yes, they fight over resources sometimes, over territory, but more often they kill each other over ideas, over beliefs, over invisible lines they drew on maps. They've invented thousands of reasons to murder their own kind, and they pursue those reasons with a creativity and dedication that exceeds anything in our archives. Hora pulled up another file. There's more. They don't just do this and forget. They document everything. They have museums dedicated to their worst moments. They teach it to their children. They write books and make films and create monuments. They're obsessed with their own capacity for horror. Why would they do that? Shrike asked. I don't know yet, Hora said, but I think we need to find out. This species is different from anything we've encountered. Their relationship with fear is complex. Al stood, her presence filling the chamber. I'm making a formal recommendation to the High Command. Earth becomes priority 1 research subject, effective immediately. We establish a permanent observation post. This division's sole focus is now humanity. We need to understand how one species contains this much capacity for terror. We need to understand how they live with it. And we need to understand whether this represents a threat to the collective itself. The room fell silent. A threat. The Dread Collective had existed since before most galaxies formed. They had toppled empires and fed on the nightmares of 1 trillion souls. The idea that some mammals on a minor planet could threaten them seemed absurd. But as Hora looked around the room at her colleagues' unsettled forms, she realized the threat was already real. They had been changed by what they'd seen. For the first time in her 3,000 years, she felt something like fear. And she suspected this was only the beginning. Part 2. 6 months into the study, Hora stopped sleeping. The Dread Collective didn't technically need sleep, but most of them still did it, cycling through periods of rest to process information and maintain stability. Now Hora found herself unable to stop reviewing the files. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw trench warfare. She heard the screams from Auschwitz. She felt the heat from Hiroshima. The medical division diagnosed her with something they'd never seen before. They called it empathy dysfunction. Somehow, exposure to human suffering had created a feedback loop in her consciousness. She was beginning to care about the individuals in the historical records, not just analyze them as data points. "You should take a break," Shrike suggested one morning. He'd been assigned as her primary research partner, helping her catalog the endless streams of human conflict. "I can't," Hora said, pulling up another file. "Look at this. Vietnam War. They had something called booby traps, sticks covered in human waste hidden in pits. Step in the wrong place and wooden stakes pierce through your leg, infecting you with disease. But that's not the worst part." She expanded the file. "The worst part is that both sides did it. The Vietnamese were defending their home, but the Americans were there because they believed in something called the domino theory. They thought if one country became communist, others would fall like dominoes. So they sent 58,000 of their own young people to die in jungles halfway around the world for a theory." "And did the theory prove true?" Shrike asked. "No, Vietnam became communist. The dominoes didn't fall, and both sides were traumatized for generations." Hora's form shimmered with something like sadness. "The Americans who came home were treated as villains by their own people. Many killed themselves. They developed something called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Their minds couldn't process what they'd done and seen." Shrike was quiet for a moment. "We've been approaching this wrong," he said finally. "What do you mean?" "We keep focusing on the weapons and the tactics, the horror, but I've been reading something else." He pulled up his own research file. "Letters. Human soldiers write letters home from war zones. I've been analyzing thousands of them." He displayed one on the viewing sphere, a letter from a soldier in World War II to his mother. The handwriting was shaky. The paper was stained and torn, but the words made Hora's core ache in ways she couldn't explain. The soldier wrote about missing home, about wanting to see his little sister graduate, about hoping the war would end soon, about loving his mother and wishing he could hug her one more time. He wrote about his friends who had died, about being scared, about hoping he'd done the right thing by enlisting. "He died 2 days after writing this," Shrike said quietly. "Killed by artillery fire in France. He was 19 years old." Hora stared at the letter. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I don't understand it. This human was in the middle of one of history's greatest horrors. He'd seen his friends die. He knew he might die, but he still felt love. He still had hope. He still cared about his sister's graduation." Shrike's form rippled with confusion. "How is that possible?" They spent the next week analyzing the contradiction. The data was overwhelming. For every atrocity, there were acts of kindness. Soldiers sharing rations with starving civilians. Medics treating wounded enemies. The Christmas truce of 1914, when soldiers from both sides climbed out of their trenches, sang carols together, and played soccer in no man's land before returning to killing each other the next day. "They compartmentalize," Hora theorized. "They hold both horror and hope simultaneously. They don't let one erase the other." But that explanation felt incomplete. She dug deeper into human culture, looking beyond just the wars themselves. What she found disturbed her even more than the violence. The humans had created entire fields of study around their own darkness. Psychology to understand trauma, sociology to examine group violence, philosophy to question the nature of evil. They had invented concepts like war crimes and crimes against humanity. They had created international laws specifically to limit their own capacity for horror. "Look at the Geneva Conventions," she showed Al during one of their weekly briefings. "After World War II, they sat down and wrote rules for warfare. Rules. They agreed that even in combat there are things you shouldn't do. No torturing prisoners. No attacking civilians deliberately. No using certain weapons." Do they follow these rules? Al asked. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but that's not the point. The point is they made them. They acknowledged their own darkness and tried to contain it with laws and treaties and international courts. Hora pulled up more data. They have museums dedicated to their worst moments. The Holocaust Museum, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, the killing fields in Cambodia. They force themselves to remember. Why? So it won't happen again. At least that's what they say. Never forget is written on memorial after memorial. They study their nightmares not to relive them but to prevent their repetition. Al was silent for a long time. This is unprecedented, she finally said. In all our studies across all dimensions, we've never encountered a species that processes fear this way. Most species run from their traumas, they suppress them. They pretend they didn't happen, but humans, they build monuments to horror. They teach it to their children. They turn it into art. Hora pulled up examples, war poetry. Apocalypse Now, The Pianist, List. Humans had created thousands of artistic works about their own capacity for evil, not to celebrate it but to bear witness. They're trying to make meaning from meaninglessness, Hora said. Every war memoir, every documentary, every museum exhibit is an attempt to transform horror into understanding, to take something that should destroy them and turn it into something else. Does it work? Al asked. I don't know, but they keep trying. Generation after generation, they keep trying. The research team expanded their study. Junior analysts focused on veteran support groups, beings who had experienced combat helping other beings who had experienced combat, talking about their nightmares together, finding solidarity in shared trauma. Analysts specialized in peace movements, humans who had lost family members to war dedicating their lives to preventing future wars. Organizations like Doctors Without Borders going into war zones to heal anyone who needed help, regardless of which side they were on. The data painted a picture that made no sense by the collective's understanding of fear. Horror should paralyze, trauma should destroy, terror should break the mind. But somehow, humans took their worst experiences and transformed them into activism, art, healing, and hope. 3 months later, the High Command requested a preliminary report. Al assembled the team to prepare their findings. She looked around the room at her colleagues and saw what she'd feared. They had all been changed. Their forms were different, softer somehow. The sharp edges of eternal predators had been dulled by months of exposure to human complexity. We have a problem, she announced. The High Command wants to know if Earth represents a viable fear-harvesting opportunity, but I don't think we can give them the answer they expect. What do you mean? Hora asked, though she already knew. I mean that harvesting human fear using our conventional methods would fail, because human fear is fundamentally different from anything we've encountered. It's not just an emotion they experience. It's a tool they use. They've weaponized their own terror in ways we don't fully understand. And worse, they've learned to transmute it into something else entirely. What does that mean for the collective? Asked nervously. Al's form darkened. It means we have to make a choice. Either we recommend that Earth be quarantined as incompatible with our methods, or we tell the High Command something that might change everything we are. Which is, Shrike asked. That maybe we've been wrong about fear all along. That maybe terror isn't just something to feed on. That maybe there's another way to exist. The room fell silent. The idea was heretical. The Dread Collective had existed for eons on a simple principle. Fear sustains, fear empowers, fear is the fundamental force of existence. To question that was to question everything. But Hora looked at the letter from the 19-year-old soldier still displayed on her screen. She thought about the Christmas truce, about the peace treaties written in blood, about the humans who walked into hell and somehow carried hope with them. We have to tell them the truth, she said, whatever that costs us. Part 3. The High Command convened in the Grand Chamber, a space that existed in all 17 dimensions simultaneously. Al stood at the center, her research team arrayed behind her. Above them, the 7 elders of the Dread Collective manifested as presences too vast to fully perceive, their attention focused like crushing weight on the analysts below. "Report," commanded Elder, their voice resonating through probability itself. Al steadied herself. In 3,000 years of service, she had never been this afraid, but she had learned from the humans that fear could be transformed into courage. "The Earth study has been completed," she began. "Our findings are unprecedented. Humanity possesses the most sophisticated relationship with fear of any species we've ever encountered. However, they cannot be harvested using conventional methods." "Explain." Elder Goth's voice carried edges that could slice through reality. Al projected the data into the chamber. Battlefields and body counts, gas chambers and mushroom clouds. The assembled elders absorbed the information in seconds. "Impressive capacity for violence," Elder observed. "Surely this represents rich harvesting potential." "That was our initial assessment," Al said carefully, "but we found something unexpected. Humans don't just experience fear and horror, they study it, they systematize it. They've created entire institutions dedicated to understanding and containing their own darkness." She pulled up examples: the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, human rights organizations, war crimes tribunals. After their worst atrocities, they invented international law. They created the concept of crimes against humanity. They agreed on rules for warfare and consequences for breaking them. They're not always successful at enforcement, but the framework exists. They acknowledge that some horrors are unacceptable even in combat. "Weakness," Elder dismissed. "Limiting their own capacity for violence makes them prey." "Does it?" Hora stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "They're still here. They've fought 2 world wars that killed millions. They've developed weapons that could destroy their entire planet. They've committed genocides and atrocities beyond counting. And yet their species survives. Their civilization continues. They even grow stronger." She projected new data, medical advances from war research, technologies developed from military programs, international cooperation born from shared trauma. They transform their horror into progress. Every major conflict generates innovations they later use for healing. Antibiotics, trauma surgery, prosthetics, even the internet, all partially developed from military research. They take the tools of death and repurpose them for life. Elder's presence contracted with interest. "Continue." Shrike materialized beside Hora, adding his research. "They have something they call post-traumatic growth. Veterans who experience combat and are traumatized by it don't just survive the trauma. Some of them become counselors, helping other veterans. They turn their worst experiences into wisdom they share with others who suffer. They create meaning from meaninglessness." He displayed letters, memoirs, and support group transcripts. Human beings who had experienced hell and somehow found purpose in helping others navigate similar darkness. "This shouldn't be possible," Shrike said. "According to our models, trauma of this magnitude should destroy consciousness. Instead, humans often emerge from it with deeper empathy, stronger purpose, and greater resilience. They call it growing through suffering." Presented the cultural analysis. They've created art from their nightmares, war poetry that's considered among their finest literature, films about conflict that win awards and shape cultural consciousness, paintings of horror that hang in museums. They don't hide from their darkness. They stare at it directly and turn it into something that teaches, that warns, that transforms. The elders were silent, processing this information. Finally, Elder Goth spoke. "You're saying these creatures have weaponized their own fear. They've made it useful to themselves." "More than that," Al said. "They've created a cycle. They experience horror, they process it, they learn from it, they pass those lessons forward. Each generation studies the mistakes of the previous one. They created phrases like, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Their entire educational system includes teaching children about humanity's worst moments. To what end? Elder demanded. To prevent repetition, to build empathy, to remember the cost of hatred and fear. Al pulled up images from human schools, children visiting Holocaust museums, students reading about Hiroshima, young people learning about slavery and segregation and genocide. They teach their children to be horrified by what their ancestors did. They don't celebrate the darkness. They acknowledge it and pledge to do better. And do they? Elder asked. Do they succeed? Sometimes, Hora admitted. Sometimes spectacularly. Sometimes they fail just as spectacularly. They're still fighting wars, still committing atrocities, still capable of tremendous evil, but the trajectory matters. They've abolished legal slavery in most of their world. They've created international humanitarian law. They've built systems, however imperfect, to protect civilians and prisoners. They keep trying to be better than they were. She projected one final piece of data: children's drawings from war zones, stick figures holding hands, flowers growing from rubble, peace signs and hearts drawn in crayon by children who lived in conflict zones but still believed in hope. "This is what broke us," Hora said quietly. "We spent months studying human warfare. We saw every horror they're capable of inflicting, and then we found these. Children who live in war zones, who lost parents and homes and safety, and they still draw pictures of hope. They still believe tomorrow might be better. That's not weakness. That's not delusion. That's something we don't have a word for." The chamber fell into heavy silence. The elders' presences shifted, their attention turning inward as they considered the implications. "You're saying we cannot harvest this species," Elder Goth finally stated. "I'm saying harvesting them would be pointless," Al corrected. "Their fear is already being used by them in ways more sophisticated than anything in our archives. But more importantly, I'm saying we should learn from them." The temperature in the chamber dropped several degrees across multiple dimensions. The suggestion was heresy. The Dread Collective learned nothing from lesser beings. They were the masters of fear, not students. "Explain yourself carefully," Elder said, their voice carrying warning. Al took a breath she didn't need. "The collective has existed for eons, feeding on fear. We harvest terror from countless species to sustain our realm. But these humans have discovered something we never considered. Fear doesn't have to be only food or weapon. It can be teacher. It can be transformer. It can be catalyst for growth." She gestured to her team. "We've all been changed by this research. We've experienced what humans call empathy, compassion, even hope. These were dysfunctions before. Now I'm not sure, because I've seen what humans accomplish by holding both darkness and light simultaneously. They acknowledge their capacity for evil while striving toward good. They remember their mistakes while building toward better futures." "You're suggesting we fundamentally alter our nature," Elder said slowly. "I'm suggesting our nature might not be as fundamental as we thought. We've existed one way for so long we forgot there might be alternatives." Al straightened, committing fully to the path she'd chosen. "I recommend Earth be placed under special protection status. Too dangerous to approach directly, too valuable to destroy. And I recommend we continue studying them, not as food source or threat, but as something entirely new in our experience. Teachers." The chamber erupted in conflicting energies. Conservative factions among the lower ranks expressed outrage. Progressive elements showed tentative interest. The elders remained still, weighing the implications. Finally, Elder spoke. "This recommendation is unprecedented. It challenges our foundational understanding of existence. The matter requires extended deliberation." "In the interim," Elder added, "Earth receives provisional protection, no harvesting operations, observation only. The Analytical Division is hereby converted to the Philosophy Division," Elder Goth announced. "Your mandate: continued study of humanity's relationship with fear, trauma, and hope. Report your findings annually." The elders began to withdraw, their presences fading from the chamber. But Elder paused, their attention focused on Hora. "You were frightened of us today," the elder observed. "Yet you spoke anyway. That is courage. Another concept we've dismissed as weakness. Perhaps you've already learned from these humans." Then they were gone, and the research team stood alone in the chamber. "What have we done?" whispered. "Changed everything," Al said. "Or started to, at least." Hora looked at her colleagues, seeing the fear and hope mixed in their forms. They had been altered irrevocably by contact with humanity. They could never return to what they were before. And she realized that was exactly how humans must feel after trauma. Changed, uncertain, but still moving forward. She returned to her office and pulled up the data files one more time. The wars and weapons, the treaties and transformations, the horror and hope all tangled together in humanity's messy, beautiful, terrible history. For the first time in 3,000 years, Hora felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt inspired. These strange mammals from Earth, with their infinite capacity for both darkness and light, had taught the Dread Collective's greatest analysts that fear was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. In quiet observation posts scattered across multiple dimensions, other members of the Dread Collective monitored humanity's continued development. They watched conflicts resolve and new ones ignite. They saw progress and regression, triumph and tragedy, all playing out on that small blue planet. And slowly, carefully, other analysts began requesting transfers to the philosophy division. They wanted to understand the beings who had weaponized hope as effectively as they'd weaponized horror. The beings who fell into darkness and somehow found light there. The beings who taught nightmares how to dream. Earth's protection status became permanent, not because humanity needed protection from the collective, but because the collective needed protection from what humanity represented. The possibility of change, the power of hope, and the revolutionary idea that even the darkest beings could learn to be something more. Somewhere in the observation data, a human child in a war-torn city was drawing a picture of flowers. And across dimensions, beings who fed on fear were learning to feel hope instead.